Hello there, friends and neighbors. Thanks for coming back to my channel. This is me, Stella Hendricks, and today we're gonna read about the Wild Rose, Notorious Prostitute of Virginia City, Nevada, by Barbara Hegne. She wrote a bunch of these informative little books. We'll read off a couple of them real quick. Harlots, Hurdies, and Other Spirited Women of Virginia City, Nevada. Rascals and Renegades, plus a few forgotten people of the Comstock Lode. The Nevada Vigilante Hangings. Virginia City, Carson City, Dayton, Aurora. The History of Virginia City, Nevada Cemeteries. Wild Tales, the Early Settlers of Rogue Valley, Logging the Rogue Valley, and Steve Wilson Era, The Golden Days of Logging. So she is incredibly well researched. She gets a lot of this straight from like the territorial enterprises and other newspapers of the day. So super, super fascinating and accurate information. The Wild Rose, Notorious Prostitute of Virginia City, Nevada. When the Wild Rose hit the Comstock in the spring of 1861, she had money to burn and a plan to make it work for her. She wasn't your ordinary camptown girl. She was shrewd, gutsy, and clever. Was the Wild Rose a natural entrepreneur or just a gifted harlot? Read the saga of Wild Rose and decide for yourself. In the spring of 1860, a visitor to the mining gold camp of Virginia City, Nevada, described it as a hodgepodge settlement. Tents of canvas, of blankets, of brush, of potato socks and old shirts, with empty whiskey barrels for chimneys, smoking hovels of mud and stove, coyote holes in the nearby hillsides forcibly seized by men, pits and shanties with smoke issuing from every crevice, piles of goods and rubbish on craggy points, in the hollows, on the rocks, in the mud, on the snow, everywhere, scattered broadcast in a mell-pell confusion, as if the clouds had suddenly burst overhead and rained down the dregs of all the flimsy, rickety, filthy little hovels and rubbish of merchandise that had ever undergone the process of evaporation from the earth since the days of Noah. By the end of 1860, the Comstock mushroomed into a city that had 38 stores, 25 saloons, 10 livery stables, 2 quartz mills, 5 lumber yards, 9 restaurants, 8 hotels and boarding houses, and 8 law offices along with other businesses. In addition, the population swelled to 2,244 people. That population, besides merchants, included miners of all nationalities, gamblers, bandits, and prostitutes. Wild Rose Benjamin followed the miners' rush and arrived on the Comstock in the early months of 1861. Rose was only 19 years old. She was born in England and may have migrated to the United States with her parents. In the early days of Virginia City, A Street was one of the main streets of the settlement. In May 1861, Rose purchased a lot and a large house on A Street between a butcher stop and a stable. The house Rose purchased had formerly been used by the city as a hospital. In November of that same year, Rose purchased the adjoining lot and opened a saloon, which added one more drinking place to the Comstock. Rose also purchased a gold and silver mine. Young and savvy Rose was determined to make money in Virginia City and make it her home. Between 1861 and 1862, Rose spent $950 for 120 feet of the Birdsall mine, which contains precious metals of gold and silver, and was located on the Montana Ledge. She sold her property on A Street to Sarah Folsom and made a $400 profit. With this money, she purchased a large house and land down the hillside on D Street. Rose had spent a total of $1,800 on land. Just after Rose sold her A Street property, a fire swept through that part of town and destroyed many buildings, several of which belonged to prostitutes. Good luck followed Rose when in 1863, the mining boom caused property values to soar. She sold some of her D Street property that she paid $800 to for a man from San Francisco to a man from San Francisco for $4,500. A large profit for Rose. By 1863, the dens of iniquity, gambling halls, saloons, and dance halls were crowded with eager men and women anxious to live their lives to the fullest. Fashionable stores opened in Virginia City, and the ladies had access to gowns, lace slips, hats, and all the latest fashions from San Francisco. One early visitor to the Comstock described the fashions of the dance hall women and ladies of the bordellos. Birds of paradise, decked out in gay dresses, brilliant feathers, and showy jewelry, promenaded slowly up and down C Street, proudly displaying vari-colored plumage to rows of ragged, rusty crows who lined the streets with ravenous eyes. The prostitutes and dance hall girls were on every street corner and in every saloon. Rose turned her 2-story house on D Street into a dance hall, saloon, and brothel. She became known as Madame Rose, and she had young girls ages 20 to 23 working for her. Other women of all nationalities opened houses of prostitution, and the entire 2-block section of North D Street was known as the Sporting Row. Virginia City became a wild, rip-roaring mining camp where the nightlife of drinking, dancing, gambling, and wild women were the norm. Business was good, however. The respectable businessmen wanted to curtail some of the wild activities in the town, and this meant making laws. In August 1863, the Board of Aldermen adopted an ordinance regarding the location of houses of prostitution in an effort to keep them out of the main section of town, this being A, B, and C streets. The ordinance made it illegal for any house of prostitution to be located west of D Street, south of Sutton Avenue, or north of Mill Street. It also set forth that any owner of a house or property included in the district who rented their property for the occupancy of women of bad or immoral character shall give and pay the city $500. The area of allowed prostitution was zoned and rezoned several times. However, most of the houses of prostitution remained on North and South D Street. Other ordinances were adopted that prohibited women from showing themselves about their houses and made mandatory the windows of the brothels were closed and covered with curtains and blinds. Rose's 2-story house was a cut above some of the other houses in the district. She provided individual rooms for each girl, a lounge to entertain customers, a bar, a dance hall, and a kitchen where meals were prepared. In the evening, the parlor was filled with merrymakers, drinking, dancing, and partying. Rose ran a tight ship and expected her girls to attend to business and pay their share of the expenses. When Rose caught Carrie Richardson, one of her new recruits, stealing, she turned her into the law and filed charges. Carrie tried to skip out without paying her part of the financial agreement, and Madame Rose, not to be outdone by anyone, kept Carrie's trunk with all her worldly goods. Some of the other prostitutes felt sorry for Carrie and tried to carry her trunk out of the building behind Rose's back. When Rose caught them, she was fit to be tied and had them all arrested for petty larceny and disturbing the peace. When the matter came up before the court, there was a grand array of wit, beauty, and talent. As always, there was a large crowd of interested souls come to hear the case. Customers, drunks, and simply interested people jammed the courtroom. Although the case dragged out for a month, it was dismissed, much to the disappointment of the crowd, who enjoyed the entertainment. Before coming to the Comstock, prostitute Carrie Richardson was a hard case, plying her trade in Pioche, Nevada, where she made a not-so-famous name for herself. One evening, Carrie went on a rampage while high on benzene. The newspaper reported that Carrie displayed disgraceful antics and vile threats and imprecations. Carrie had an audience of 200 onlookers to her antics. Officer McKee arrested her and ran her out of town. Thus, Carrie caught the stage to Virginia City and took up residence at Rose's house. However, Rose was not one to put up with anyone's nonsense except her own, and Carrie was the loser. Looking for a home. In 1874, the prostitutes were on the hunt for new places to conduct their business. The Virginia and Truckee Railroad Company acquired all the land on the east side of D Street for their warehouses, side tracks, and depot. This land had rows of prostitute dwellings. The railroad company tore down all the houses of prostitution and graded off the ground. While many of the disturbed prostitutes scattered around town and took up shop in saloons and other places of business, Rose was not bothered, as her place was not on the block where the railroad depot was being built. With no families, the prostitutes considered each other sisters, and they stuck together through the good times and bad. Some of Rose's girls became prostitute out of necessity to put food in their mouths. Many of these girls felt degraded, and some of them became despondent. Most of the girls did not use their real names. Rose's working girls included Laura Christie, Susan Brown, Molly Lymans, Mary Cooper, Frankie Norton, Nellie Booth, Minnie Johnson, Maggie Hickey, Laura Franklin, Hattie Willis, Belle Bateman, Kate Thompson, Hattie Peters, Laura Steele, Christine Richardson, I think we have Frankie Jordan in here twice, and Lena Hunter. Out of these girls, Kate Thompson, Hattie Willis, Laura Steele, Frankie Norton, Laura Franklin, and Rose's great niece, Antonia Sanchez, all tried to kill themselves, but some were unsuccessful. Dear me. Troubled girls. 16-year-old Hattie Willis, who went by the stage name of Belle Bateman, and 21-year-old Kate Thompson came to Virginia City in March 1872 with the Amelia Dean Melodeon Troupe and performed at Piper's Opera House. When their engagement was over, the two girls decided to stay in Virginia City. They both took a job at Rose's brothel, but after 5 months of working as a prostitute, they found no glamour in the occupation and became tired of life. The two girls made a suicide pact to end their lives. Kate, who was described as a tall, fine-looking woman, was married and had problems with her husband. She had tried suicide several times before, but was always saved. Kate went to the local drugstore on C Street, where she purchased a grain of morphine and half an ounce of laudanum. You could just go and get that back then. She claimed that she needed the morphine for a friend who had a bad toothache, and she said she wanted the laudanum for herself as she was having trouble sleeping. She was able to get some drugs from other places, but enough for both herself and Hattie to do the job. At the house, the girls gathered for dinner that evening, including Belle and Katie. The two girls were very pleasant, and after supper, they began kidding and playing games in the parlor. No one would suspect what they were about to do. The two girls disappeared and were not missed until an hour and a half later. The entire house was searched, and finally the two girls were discovered in an empty room, slumped over on the floor. A doctor was called, and he administered mustard, water, and strong coffee. He also used a fine electrical battery to try to bring the girls back to life. My heavens. All his efforts failed, and both girls died. A simple one-line note was left. I hope we have made a sure thing of it this time, as we are tired of living. Goodbye, everybody. Hattie Willis and Katie Thompson. 8 months later, another one of Rose's girls, Laura Franklin, took a large amount of morphine in an attempt to kill herself. When her fellow sisters discovered her, they tried desperately to save her life. They forced her to take a treatment of mustard and olive oil. Then they shook her and walked her around, and after much whipping and rolling, they revived her. Rose owned 4 properties on D and C streets. Although she suffered several fires that destroyed some of her property, she escaped the big fires of 1866 and 1871 that destroyed many other houses of prostitution. In 1873, one of Rose's houses near the corner of D and Union Streets caught fire when someone knocked over a coal oil lamp. The Virginia Engine Company responded and sprayed gallons of water on the fire and quickly put the fire out. Little damage was done by the fire, but there was considerable loss of structure and fixtures due to severe water damage. In 1873, Rose took on a lover named George Perkins. He was 5 years older than Rose and worked as a speculator. Although Rose kept a close eye on her brothels, Rose and George took a place of residence on C Street out of the prostitute district. The baby, Rose's worst heartbreak. Ooh, excuse me. One of Rose's acquaintances, young Lizzie Castro, married Frederick Gamble in Pioche, Nevada. They had a stormy marriage, and after 4 months, Lizzie left Frederick and went to Salt Lake, Utah, where she worked in a house of prostitution. It was there she discovered she was 4 months pregnant. Lizzie gave birth to a baby boy on December 28, 1873. Lizzie was in no financial or mental state to take care of a child. In April, when the baby was 4 months old, she went to Virginia City to see Rose. Lizzie begged Rose to take the baby, and Rose agreed, but not without a legal contract. Together, they set up the following contract, which stated that Lizzie was in agreement in making Rose the true and lawful guardian of my infant son Albert for the period of his minority, and I hereby do further sign that I will never at any time, either by law or otherwise, demand or ask the control of said Albert Gamble without the consent of said Rose Benjamin, and the said Rose Benjamin shall clothe and provide for the said Albert Gamble in sickness and in health, and supply him with suitable food and clothing, and shall cause the said Albert Gamble to be educated to read and write. The contract was witnessed by George Perkins and Robert E. Lowry. Rose loved little Albert, and with her lover, George Perkins, Rose finally had a family. All was going well for the wild Rose until July. Albert was 20 months old when, out of the blue, Frederick Gamble showed up at Rose's doorstep and demanded his son. He claimed that he had just recently become aware that Lizzie had had a baby, their child, and he wanted him. When Rose refused to give Albert to Frederick Gamble, he filed a writ of habeas corpus to the Supreme Court for the return of his son. Gamble claimed that his wife Lizzie had left his bed and board without provocation and concealed from him all knowledge of the fact of the birth or whereabouts of said Albert Gamble until the 23rd day of July 1875. He said they were divorced in June 1874, and he stated that Lizzie is an immoral and unchaste woman and is now living in adultery with one Jacob Moritz at Salt Lake City. Gamble said he was never consulted as to Rose Benjamin having his child, and that baby Albert was given to her without his knowledge, and he wanted him. Rose tried to delay her court appearance and the release of Albert to the court by obtaining a signed paper from Dr. Thompson saying the baby had diarrhea and a bad cough, and that it was not advisable to take the baby from home. Rose said she was not able to leave the baby when he was sick because he became agitated and cried for her. Rose was finally forced to appear in court, and she stated that Lizzie was working in a house of prostitution in Salt Lake City, indulging in promiscuous sexual intercourse. In addition, Rose claimed that she knew for sure that Lizzie had not cohabitated with Frederick Gamble for a period of 15 months before the baby was born. Rose charged that Gamble was an idle, dissolute, and vicious, wholly unfit to assume control of said child. Rose produced one witness, prostitute Kate Flint, to testify as to Lizzie's promiscuous activities. Rose was beside herself at the thought of losing the baby. She produced the signed agreement between herself and Lizzie, of which Lizzie said she should never be part of taking control of Albert away from her. However, in July 1875, Lizzie had signed a document telling about the birth of Albert and her marriage and divorce to Gamble. This was the first that Gamble had learned about the birth of Albert. With this signed document in hand, Gamble went to Virginia City and filed his claim. Rose fought the best she could, but in the end, she had to turn Albert over to the court. Rose's birthday party. During the trial, Rose was able to celebrate her birthday in May. She had a grand party with high times and plenty of food, music, singing, dancing, and liquor. After the festivities were over and the girls were tucked into their warm beds, one of Rose's prostitutes, Laura Steele, could be heard singing upstairs in her room until the wee hours of the morning. Later in the morning, the girls went to Laura's room and found her lying in the bed in a dying condition. Oh dear. Her face was black and she was barely breathing. She had taken laudanum. Everyone tried to save Laura, but it was too late. Her death was just one of a large number of prostitutes who'd managed to kill themselves. The prostitutes always tried to hide and downplay their sister's suicide and attempts to kill themselves because it was extremely bad for business. However, the story usually came out. Rose barely got over this life crisis when 2 months later in October, a fire burned down all the businesses in the main section of Virginia City and destroyed all the houses of prostitution on D Street, including Madame Rose's houses. By January 1876, new houses were up and going business was brisk. In no time, Rose and her sisters were back in business, and Rose had her dance hall, saloon, and girls ready and celebrating the new year in grand style. Then, that cold January 5th, 1876, one of Rose's girls, Laura Christie, died. The local newspaper wrote a seething account of how Rose had handled Christie's death and accused Rose of keeping her establishment open to make money. Horrible depravity! This is from a newspaper of the time, I think. Making money with the corpse of a dead dance girl. A most disgraceful scene was enacted all day yesterday and last night in the low dance house kept by Rose Benjamin on D Street. Laura Christie, one of the wretched girls who earned their living there, died yesterday morning. The common sense of decency would have suggested the propriety of closing the house of one night at least in such an event, but instead the proprietress, Rose, made the occasion one of money-making and constituted the poor corpse as an extra attraction for the night. The house was kept wide open and the usual orgies were allowed to proceed. In an adjoining room, the dead body was laid out with a woman named Carson hired for the occasion singing songs over it. Into this apartment, all the visitors of the house were invited and then were importuned to subscribe for the general expenses. There was no need for this, as the girls in the house had offered to bear them, but this had been allowed. Rose Benjamin would have reaped no extra harvest from the sale of cigars and drinks, and therefore it was not done. The musicians were on hand, but to the credit of the girls, they refused to dance, and therefore drinking, smoking, and singing, and coarse hilarity were the only amusements except a sight of the corpse. Rose and her girls responded. Rose and her girls were fit to be tied when they read the article and terrible account of Christie's death. They got together and Rose had the following statement printed in the newspaper explaining the other side of the story. To the public. In the Chronicle of Friday evening, an item was published of so disgraceful a nature that the public morality might well be shocked if the truth were known. In justice, both to myself and to the public in general, I will state that the article published in the Chronicle was a falsehood from beginning to end. The young lady who died at my house was both taken care of while sick and buried when dead at the expense of Miss Rose Benjamin and 2 or 3 other ladies who do not wish their names known, and also 2 or 3 gentlemen. No one outside was authorized to collect a cent, nor was a cent received from anyone outside. As regards to this woman, Mrs. Carson, she, like any other person might do, came to see the corpse and being under the influence of liquor began to sing, when she was immediately ejected from the premises. The undersigned do solemnly swear the above to be the truth, and also that they were not asked, nor did they volunteer, to bear the expenses of the young lady's sickness or burial. Miss Susan Brown, Molly Lyons, Mary Coo, there's a whole bunch of them on here. The saloon, P.S. The saloon was closed and no business whatsoever transacted during the evening. Miss Rose Benjamin. Let's see, how are we? All right, well, we are at about 20 minutes, and that's about halfway through, so we will do part 2 next time. Thank you very much, friends and neighbors. I'll catch you on the flip side.